Hello everyone, welcome to our review of Soul Cresta, a new high-profile shmup by the esteemed Platinum Games. I am a fan of Platinum. It is one of the few studios I still have respect for. Of course, I like Bayonetta, but I also like Star Fox Zero. And I do think that game, when it came out, got treated very unfairly by gaming reviews and gaming media. And I think it was Polygon who refused to even review the game. They made this whole virtue signaling post about how it's not even going to review it, because how dare Platinum expect them to use some hand-eye coordination for a few hours. Absolutely unacceptable. And I made a video defending Star Fox Zero a few years ago. It's sort of the janky early days of the channel, but if you want to check that out, go ahead. I bring up Star Fox Zero because I think that game and the experience with that may have given the developer a bit of shell shock with that opening quote where he brought out Star Fox Zero that got absolutely destroyed. So maybe he's thinking, oh, what's going to happen to poor Soul Cresta? They're going to eat it alive as well. But I actually don't agree with his assessment at all about what's holding back the genre of shmup, because shmups aren't really suffering from bad review scores. Maybe 10 years ago that was something, but these days, as long as you have a high-profile shmup that's somewhat presentable, you're going to get high review scores. Really, the problem of the genre is that there are 3 or 4 high-profile shmups every year that everyone just lavishes praise on and says, oh, they're the best ever. 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10. And then all the other shmups that come out that year are completely ignored. Even really good ones like definitely. There's not even a Metacritic score for probably one of the greatest games of all time, let alone one of the greatest shmups of all time. So it's kind of funny how negative review scores would probably be a bit of a step up for the genre at this point. And of course, being a person who's a little bit more known for giving negative reviews than the average bear, I was like, oh boy, okay, so this game's coming to come out. Everyone's going to give it 9 out of 10. Now you got the developer saying whoever gives it a bad review score is like destroying the genre. This is going to be a fun time. But, you know, it is my job, so I'm just going to give my honest assessment of what I think of the game. And so the first thing I want to say about Soul Cresta is that no matter how you feel about it as a game, it is definitely clear that Platinum are very passionate about the genre of shmups. They're bringing a lot to the table here. A lot of new ideas, actually, and I find that very refreshing. And of course, there's a lot of the ideas of the surface, like the whole formation mechanic and the command input mechanics and all that sort of stuff. But even underneath that, I feel that Platinum is bringing a lot of fresh takes on the genre, perhaps even accidentally, I don't know. In either case, I do think some of the ideas they try out in this game are very interesting and things that I've been curious to see what would happen if shmups tried to do it. For example, the length of the levels, that stood out to me immediately. And in fact, as I was playing through the game, the level went on so long that I was starting to wonder, wait a minute here, do the levels not separate? Is it like one giant level that just keeps going on and on? I'm like, oh, that's a pretty cool idea. But no, it actually does have levels. They're just extra long. I'll put how much longer they are than a cave level, but I would guess at about double length at this point. And that is an interesting decision to make, because we've seen this decision made recently with beat 'em ups. So beat 'em ups, they're traditionally 45 minutes long, you know, Streets of Rage and all that sort of thing. But these days, beat 'em ups are getting longer and longer, even ones that I really respect, like Fight and Rage, my favorite beat 'em up. If you're not playing with turbo on, that thing's about 2 hours long. Streets of Rage 4 is like 2.5 hours long if you're not hustling through it. So these are much longer experiences than the traditional beat 'em up. And that was an interesting idea for a shmup. What if you stretch out the length of the game? That has pros and cons, and now we can kind of evaluate how we feel about it because we have an example here. So the con of doing that is that it's going to make score play an absolute nightmare for certain scenarios. Let's say you're trying to get the world record or a really high score in Soul Cresta, and the game's like 2 hours long. Well, that first 15 minutes of this stretched out mild stage 1 and stage 2, that's going to be brutal to repeat over and over and over. And so that is a bit of a danger for doing that. The positive of doing that is that the casual fan base, the new player fan base, is probably going to appreciate this design. It doesn't whack them over the head with that nasty difficulty spike as soon. So it gives them a bit of time to sort of ease their way into the game. What's also interesting about Soul Cresta is the stage select system. So normally you have stage selects, but they're in like a training mode or whatever. But in this game, you can stage select in arcade mode, and it will count your score going forward. So example, if you go into stage 3 and just start playing stage 3, it'll be like, all right, you're just playing stage 3 now, and you can actually skip those first 2 stages And I do wonder if there's like a weird scoring meta that could develop where even though technically you should probably play the first 2 stages to get the score on those stages, because you don't want to wait around and maybe there's, you know, with the loops and everything that come later on, maybe it's not worth your time to play those stages. So you can just skip them and start right into maybe near the end of the first loop into the second loop. I think that's very interesting, and I want to see if there's any sort of scoring meta that evolves based on just the length of the levels and the stage selection system. So those were 2 ideas that Soul Cresta brought to the table that I thought were very interesting from a gameplay perspective. And I do want to hear in the comments what you all think about that. Do you like how long the game is? How gentle and easy that difficulty curve is? Or do you miss, you know, the cave smack you at stage 3, let's get down to business style difficulty curve? The other aspect of the game that definitely stood out to me is how many mechanics Soul Cresta is bringing to the table. And again, this kind of reminds me of like Bayonetta, where you have so many mechanics that I don't know if all of them are all that useful. Some of them seem much better than others, but you can kind of develop at least a bit of an individual play style by going through all these different mechanics. So let's give a quick overview of them. The big one is the formation system, and it has a lot of components to it outside of just the obvious. So the first aspect of the formation system that you probably won't notice from gameplay footage until you start playing is that it's basically bullet time, Escaluda, Bayonetta style, right? So you slow down the game. But the thing about it is when you're slowing down the game, the accuracy of your ship movement isn't adjusted for it. So your ship kind of skip around in these higher movements than you would normally. So you can't really micro using the bullet time all that much. And I think that's probably an intentional nerf on the system, but it is still incredibly useful. And in fact, it's probably more useful or just as useful as the actual formations themselves. So there's a lot of patterns that the game will throw at you that you'll say, all right, well, this is hard to deal with, but as long as I activate bullet time, I can bullet time through the difficult part, get information or not even enter formation. And then of course you have the formations themselves. And the thing I will say about this is it reminds me a lot of Wonderful 101. I think that's a Platinum game, right? And there's times where it feels like this thing is interesting, but maybe a little bit clunky of a system. Because unlike a character action game where a lot of your analog stick movements are not all that important, you know, if you move a little bit to the left or right, not a big deal. Because it's a shmup, you know, moving slightly to the left or slightly to the right can throw a lot of things off. And the big struggle I had with the formation system is just getting it to behave itself in the time that I needed to and to get the formation that I want. And it's not necessarily the most polished implementation of it. I think it's a little bit too loose. I would have liked it if the ship snapped into formation a little bit more automatically, or as long as you kind of approximate the L, they'll just snap into the L. As long as you approximate the V, they snap into the V. The one that I use the most, because it's just the easiest to do and the most consistent and pretty powerful, is just the line across. So you see through the playthrough here, I'm going to be doing a lot of lines across because it's pretty powerful formation. It's just real simple and quick to do. I do think the idea is really cool. I just wish they may have tweaked up the way the mechanic works a little bit. And then there's a third aspect of the formation system, which is your lead ship shot type. So we got the first aspect, the formation, the second aspect, the bullet time, and now the third aspect, changing your shot type. And there's red, blue, yellow. The way it works is like red is like the spread, wider, but it's not really all that powerful. Yellow is this very narrow drill, powerful, but very narrow. And then blue is homing. And it feels like after playing the game for a few hours and stuff, the blue homing is just a beast. And so in most stages and boss fights, I just go for blue homing. That seems to work really well. And the game does add in these little hazards and boxes and things to sort of coax you into using the formation system more, being like, okay, change the blue, change the red. As you start playing for score, this is probably something you pay attention to a little bit more. But again, like the formation, I feel like the lead ship changing is a little bit clunky. I can't tell you how many times I have to try to get the lead ship to be blue. It takes sometimes like 3 or 4 tries to get it right. I do wish it was a little bit more clear, a little easier to snap into place, not so funky, because it feels like a lot of the time with Soul Cresta, with at least the bullet time formation system, is that you're fighting the mechanic a little bit more than you're fighting the enemies and bosses. Like, as long as you can get into that formation, you're good. It's just a question of can you get into it. And I do understand that there is skill there, but I just wonder if that emphasis on skill is a little bit misplaced. Maybe make the formation system easier, more intuitive, and then buff up the enemies and buff up the patterns, especially as you get into the later loops and you start dealing with suicide bullets and all that sort of stuff. So that is the formation system. And then the other mechanic that I want to comment on are the command inputs. This definitely feels like a nifty idea that Platinum had, but I don't know how well baked it is into the gameplay, because for the most part, you're not going to be using these command inputs, and some of them aren't exactly the most intuitive to pull off in the clutch. Sure, if you're just floating along waiting for things to happen, you can bust out the circle, the full circle command input. But when you're in the clutch and you've got 3 homing missiles coming in on you and you need to do a command circle input but also avoid a bullet, it's just really not the most well implemented system. I think the occasion that I used the command inputs the most is this mid-boss fight where it shoots these homing enemies at you and they'll actually fly off screen and then fly back on screen in these big hooking formations. And they're very difficult to just dodge yourself because they're big, they're fast, and they move in these big arcs while you have this thing flying in front of you. But they're also hard to hit because they're like usually coming from your side or your back. And so the way I learned to sort of cope with this is you get into the corner and then you use your corner command input shot to take them out. So it does have some purposes and uses in some of the boss fights, and there's stage hazards and stuff that you can tell were built specifically for you to use the command inputs. But for the most part, I don't think they're really all that necessary or all that integral to the gameplay, at least from my experience so far. So I think those are the ship systems that are most interesting to talk about. And now let's talk about the level design itself, because this is very interesting. And again, not something you see all that commonly. I think if I were to describe the level design of Soul Cresta, I think it would match mostly like those PC Engine Hudson Soft type of shmups, you know, Soldier Blades and all those types of things. What's interesting going on here is, of course, you have the longer levels, we've commented on that, but then the game has a lot of environmental hazards, which are not that common in vertical scrolling shmup. So cave games very rarely have environmental hazards, but this game actually has a lot of them, and it's a big part of the gameplay, sort of like you're playing Salamander or Life Force, but in vertical. You have comments that fall in from the sky, you have these little doors you have to shoot open, you've got stuff that comes up from the ground, tries to hit you. So the game is really emphasizing this aspect of the gameplay, and I do think it will be appealing to a lot of old school shmup fans. I'm not personally that into it, but I don't dislike it that much either. Though I do think some of these stage hazards are a little bit OP, like those damn doors. So after you beat the final boss, there's this escape sequence, and I will say that escape sequence is harder than the final boss by far. There's like no question about it. I lost way more lives on the escape than I did on the final boss. Of course, if you memorize it, I'm sure that isn't as much of a deal. But that brings us to actually one of my biggest criticisms of Soul Cresta, and I think this is a very fair, objective criticism, which is they needed to do a much better job differentiating the top plane from the bottom plane. So from the sky to the ground, that needed to be much more visually distinct, because the game is full of stage hazards, and a lot of the time it is so hard to tell, is this a stage hazard in the sky that it will run into me, or is this just background art that I can fly over? And so what I had to do a lot of the time is just shoot things on the screen that might have been background and see if the bullets hit them, to see, oh, is this on the ground or in the air? Because just visually looking at it, it isn't that clear, especially in some of the industrial looking stages. There were parts where I was like avoiding parts of the background when they're actually just complete background. Another problem with that, again, is the escape sequence. That one's absolutely brutal because the game's scrolling by at this huge speed, and I died over and over, not because I couldn't make the movements in time, not because I couldn't get into position in time, but literally because I thought I was flying over background and I'd hit something and die. They needed to do something with the visuals to make that distinction a little bit more clear. There's also not a shadow under your ship. That would have probably helped a bit. There's just, I think, some polish that needed to be done on the visuals, and I think a lot of people are probably going to comment on that aspect of the gameplay, because I will admit the visuals are a little bit odd as far as the way they present themselves. I'm not talking necessarily the art style, which does seem a little bit odd, but I can get into the art style a bit. I'm talking more about like the way the game moves and scrolls. It has this weird clunkiness to it. And I was playing it on the Switch version, and I think a lot of people were commenting that it runs funky on the Switch version. But even footage from watching on the PS4, it just seems to scroll and act weird. You do get used to it after a few hours of playing it, but I don't know what's going on there, but it doesn't seem to look all that good in motion at any rate. I don't think they're necessarily a game breaker or anything, though. It is a bit of a disappointment considering Platinum are so capable of doing excellent visuals, but I'm guessing that this game was purely a passion project and the budget was probably like 2 Diet Coke cans and a carton of cigarettes. Like, here you go. This is the budget for Soul Cresta, make it work. So I'm not going to be too harsh on the visuals because I do kind of like the art style and what they were going for. It just seems a little bit odd. But gameplay wise, they absolutely do need to somehow make the background elements much more clear. Again, another example of that is they have these volcano things that pop up and hit you from the bottom. And it's genuinely hard to tell where their hitboxes are based on the sprites and stuff. So they could have done some work there to make that smoother and more coherent. At times it also reminds me a little bit of Toplan and Truxton and Tatsujin, suicide bullets and the loops and just the way the enemies work. But then at times they bring in some mechanics that are, you know what, a little Euro shmuppy. For example, there's a lot of homing enemies in the game, like a lot of them. There's a lot of enemies that will track you down, they'll fly off screen, they'll like circle back around and hit you. Bosses will shoot out missiles that sort of track and try and hit you. The thing about it though is that normally I would not be a big fan of these types of ideas. However, because Soul Cresta throws so many mechanics at the player to be able to deal with this stuff, I do think it is fair at the end of the day. For example, there was this one pattern that was absolutely whipping me on this boss fight, where the boss would shoot this homing missile pattern. And at first, I was trying to play it like a regular traditional shmup. I was trying to dodge around it, shoot them and all that. I was getting wrecked, and I was like, oh,
Crikey dingo!
This game. But then I remembered, oh wait, bullet time. So now all you do is when he shoots the missiles, you just activate bullet time, and you hit them during bullet time. Not a problem. There's a ton of stuff like that, where there's a lot of patterns that at first you look at them, you're like, whoa, this is unexpectedly jank. But then you remember, oh, I have a formation, I have bullet time. And when you're down to a single ship, you can actually like do an invincible barrel roll during your single ship. So you got an invincible barrel roll in there. Then you got the commands if you want something behind you or to the sides. Or maybe every now and then you can do the circle and hit everything around you. There's just a lot of shit this game is throwing at you to be able to play with. There's just definitely a learning curve to understanding this game because Soul Cresta is playing you. You're not playing Soul Cresta, if that makes sense. The game wants you to do certain things, and by damn, you're gonna do it whether you want to or not. Again, some people may not be a big fan of this type of design. Other people may absolutely love it and think it's refreshing and awesome. So when it comes to evaluating this game, this has been probably one of the most difficult shmups I've ever had to evaluate as a reviewer because it just isn't all that clear if the game is totally working or if it's totally not working. I would say that the question of is it a masterpiece or is it a hot mess? I would say, it's a little bit lame of me, but it is what it is. I would say it's somewhere in the middle of those two. I wouldn't really put it in the masterpiece tier because it does have some clear issues, especially the visuals, especially the differentiation between the foreground and background and where that is. I'm not sure if they fully solved this whole level design thing of making the game so long because those early stages are a bit of a snooze fest because of that. But on the other hand, I do like how it loops into the hard mode, and that's like a total throwback. And so score play wise, this will be pretty interesting. And I wonder if it'll be one of those outzone type of shmups where one day on Jamer's channel, he's got like an 8-hour run of Soul Cresta or something. Because I think when it comes to the scoring system, I was going to comment on it in more detail. The thing about it, it's just going to come down to endurance, I think. I don't know how far the game loops. I saw a comment by Jamers that it like locked up on the 7th or 8th loop or something, but it might be intended to loop for a very long time. So then, you know, that just makes the score play. Well, how long can you loop it? How long can you make that work? Rather than, you know, really worrying too much about the nitty-gritty details of the scoring system. Though I do like the extend system. Speaking of scoring system, I do like how it has like that Garega style extend system where you just get a new extend. I don't know if there's rank or not in the game. That was very hard to pick up on. It seemed like there might have been because at the bottom it says like level and everything, but that might be referring to the loop. Overall, I did have a lot of fun playing the game. I would say it is a recommend from myself. But the final question about it is if you want to get the DLC and the price point. So Soul Cresta is an expensive boy, but I would say that if you like the game, if you want to play the game, I would say that it is worth the price because this thing packs a lot of content into there. I mean, for one, the game is like 2 hours long just by default, right? And then it has the loops, and the loops are different from one another in that not only do they add in suicide bullets, but they literally like bring in new enemy formations, change up the boss patterns. It's like a full-on adjustment. It's not just, oh, we're going to turn up the bullet speed a bit here and there. Like they bring in different boss patterns, different enemy formations. I think the hard loop is a lot of fun to play, honestly. And then there's all the mechanics this game brings to the table that I can see a lot of people playing with. So I think my notes on Soul Cresta would be they figure out something with the visuals to make them smoother, a little bit less funky looking at times, at least in motion, and then figure out a way to make the sky plane stand out more from the background plane. I don't know if you need to do some shading and shadow work or whatever you need to do, but overall I was actually pretty surprised by how well Platinum did for this first shmup, and maybe hopefully we'll see more from them in the future, hopefully with, you know, like more beefy graphics, because that's something I would love to see. But as far as the DLC goes, no, absolutely not. In my opinion, I was not a fan of this DLC. I would definitely hold out on buying that until you're totally sure you want it. Because what it is basically adds in like a story mode where you got voiceover. I think Raiden 5 has something like this, and people are talking to each other, which would be fine, except for the fact that it's clear that the game sort of pauses itself to have these lines go and everything like that. So the stretched out stages, there's sections of it where you're just like hanging out for like 8 seconds, waiting for the dialogue to go, and that's just not cool. So I actually could only manage to sit through the first stage of dramatic mode, so maybe later on in the DLC it just gets awesome, but the first stage did not leave a good impression just by how long it makes you wait around. But I guess if you're into the story or want to know what's going on in the story, that's the way to do it. So thanks so much. I hope this was helpful. We're getting close to that 10k sub, so I'd really appreciate a subscribe. Let all your friends know. I'm very relieved that I didn't have to stick my head out too far on this one. I think a lot of people are kind of coming at the game at a similar angle than I am this time around. So adios, everyone. Thank you to the $5 patrons: 100, Dingo, Another Joe, Anthony A, Anthony Iodice, Aaron Solis, Ben, Blur STG, Borgie22, Brian Reboot, Brian Shiver, Bubblegum Crisis 1394, Chris Yuzefovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Cook Some Soup, Corey Mark, DES Audio, Danielle Savage, Darren Griffin, Delta Tango 6, Disco Stas Leia, DJ 420, Praise It, Eric H, FCK, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Hausu, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Jim Knockham, Joe Angelo, John Kelly, Game Boy Guru, K, K2, Kikoman 589, Larridge, Malaise, Mark Toms, Megadeth 859, Minung, Mechalin, Mitch LY, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Plasmo, Portal 63, Rattlecat, Raul, Rilskeen, Riff Mason, Rolf015, Scanline City, Seesaw FW, 7 Overdose, Shane Sintiensky, SLW, The Boot Rex, The Real Ikuzo, The Dirty Screech, The Old Bensta, TRM, Sugumo, Twilight EX, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.